Today is April 8th, and I'm going to talk about the idea of mutual acceptance. So, what is mutual acceptance? When do you achieve it in your contract? What makes a contract void or voidable? And how can you tell a contract is mutual? We'll talk about what forms can be in the contract or left out of the contract and still have the contract be mutual. And then, can you have mutual acceptance without something really important like the legal description? So, first of all, I started going through this class and I was thinking it was going to be really, really easy. Like, of course, we all know what mutual acceptance is. But then I got to thinking and I got into the weeds and I figured, I'd talk about this because there is some confusion. So, where does that confusion come in? Well, a lot of times it comes in because we have somebody who is handling our contracts once they become mutual, and we don't have that person involved in all the communication up front. So, in order to make a mutual contract, we're going to talk about what that actually means on the broker side, and then think about what it means on the transaction coordination side too. How do we keep this kind of communication, and how do we provide that information to our transaction coordinators? Because if there's something like a missing initial or a missing form, that TC is not going to know if it was included originally or not. So first I wanted to go kind of to the basics and just think about what the rules of mutual acceptance truly are. So to have mutual acceptance, we want to make sure we have the full contract signed by the buyer. Then have that full contract be delivered to the listing broker and the listing firm, as well as our firm. And we want to have both buyer and seller sign that contract without changing any of the terms. We want to make sure we're also CCing the TC at mutual acceptance and keeping in mind that what we move back and forth in these emails is truly what is included in the purchase and sale agreement, whether it is signed or not. When it comes to delivery, we actually have a very defined term for delivery. This is a paragraph taken out of Form 21. It's paragraph K. It literally bullet points exactly how to properly deliver something in order to constitute official delivery. Now, it does make a note that any of the counter offers and offers have to be done in writing. We can't just pick up the phone and say, oh, oops, we decided we want to change something in that offer, or have a verbal offer in place, because we are part of the Washington Statute of Frauds, where everything that we do has to be documented and it has to be done so in writing. Now, when we give the notice, we're going to give notice to the listing broker as well as the listing firm. And if it comes to something like a disclosure, it is possible for one of the sellers to initial a disclosure to be delivered. However, keep in mind, if we are sending things with one initial or one signature when there are two people on the contract, we're going to create confusion, especially with our file. So looking back, are you going to be able to prove that you have, in fact, shown both sellers this, both sellers were aware of it, or that it was delivered to both people? So with that in mind, I want the practice to still remain that we have everything initialed by both parties. And then right here on the bottom line 141, it says buyer and seller must keep buyer broker and listing broker advised of their whereabouts in order to receive prompt notification of receipt of a notice. I've actually heard several times, especially as summer comes up, buyers or sellers are disappearing, and we need to make sure that as their agents, we keep in contact with them, because the idea of delivery is what completely delegates how this contract works. I don't really like to read verbatim what the contract says. However, I think it is super important that we look at the second part of this. The second part gives us definitions of how to deliver. And it says a facsimile, which we no longer live in the 1980s. We now have email and much more modern ways of communication. But a fax will constitute as delivery. Email transmission of a notice or a document will constitute when you've done these three things. I bullet pointed them on the bottom, but they are actually laid out in lines 144 through 149. An offer has to be emailed to both the buyer broker and listing broker and each of their firms. The other way you can deliver is if the offer is emailed only to the broker, they have to acknowledge it. And once acknowledged, that will be the proof of delivery. Or if you have an unrepresented buyer, that unrepresented buyer's email that they've given you is a proof of delivery. So think about number 2 here. Number 1, it is an automatic proof of delivery. We don't need to wait for a reply. If we are dealing with a broker who may not be very responsive and we are only emailing that broker, our official delivery is when they acknowledge receiving it. And an automatic reply is not an acknowledgement of receiving it. So I just wanted to bring up this question. A buyer broker submits an offer on Friday at 10 a.m. The seller responds with a counteroffer the same day and sends it to the buyer broker at 5 p.m. The buyer broker accepts it and signs the counteroffer on Saturday, but that buyer broker does not notify or email the accepted offer until Monday. Is mutual acceptance Saturday when the buyer signed, or is it Monday when it was delivered? And the answer is mutual acceptance is when it was delivered. So based on the facts, the mutual acceptance did occur Monday. And this also assumes that that offer didn't expire before Monday. Don't let this happen to you, and make sure that we are actually sending it to the broker and their firm just in case somebody doesn't end up responding. So back to the basics, we're going to go to the purchase and sale agreement and talk about what it takes to create a binding contract. We want to create a mutual contract that has enforceable terms. Otherwise, what's the point? What makes a contract mutual? So let's start by looking at some of these items that can or could, some of these items can be changed without changing terms, and some of them cannot. So while we're talking about this, think about the basic rules of mutual acceptance. If no changes are made, all parties must sign their full, if no changes are being made, all parties must sign their full signatures on the Form 21. Each page of the addenda must be proven to have been seen by all the parties. So in order to accomplish this, we do this by getting them initialed. A missing initial will not void mutual acceptance if there was no change to the contract terms. Any counteroffer should be written on a Form 36, the counteroffer form. It creates the most clear line of what was being changed and keeps the communication very streamlined. If you're using a Form 36, there is no need to go back and initial the changes that you've made in the purchase and sale agreement. In fact, you should probably avoid this to give better clarity of the items changed with the new counteroffer terms. And if there's no if there's no offer or counteroffer expiration date, it is defaulted to 2 business days. So when you look at the purchase and sale agreement, the date would be the day that you're writing up the contract. MLS number will auto-populate. And then the offer expiration date is always defaulted to 9 p.m. that day. The offer date is not important. And the MLS number, if it's wrong or left blank, does not do anything to change the mutual agreement of a contract. Your offer expiration date is one of your most important lines in line 1. When it comes to buyer and seller, we need to make sure as agents that we are copying down the buyer's full name or the seller's full name or legal trust or corporation. The sellers can be found in the title report, and the buyers, if you have a question about it, can be found on their driver's license or whatever their form of ID is. Our legal description is going to be auto-populated if you've pulled it from the MLS. Make sure you are checking the legal description with the tax parcel number, because they may not match. And what matters the most is the legal description. So although it auto-populates, please make sure that's one of the items we are checking. The MLS terms, like I said, of these 2 items will not change mutual acceptance if they're wrong. They can easily be corrected without needing an extra initial. A most important date, again, is the offer expiration date, because in order to have a contract mutual, we need to make sure it was all signed and delivered within that time frame. Buyer and seller names, again, must match their full names. If anything is undisclosed, that name has to be disclosed on the purchase and sale agreement. No parties can remain anonymous, and their signatures must also match their legal full names. So if you have ABC LLC, a Washington limited liability company, as the seller, then that is the signature line that goes below. If you have a seller who signs on behalf of a corporation or LLC, that seller will have a signature block that will be specific to them. And if you have any questions about this, the title company can actually provide you the name that needs to be written down. There are going to be several times in our careers where we're going to find these names either don't fit, or we need to be changing them to match up to what they were supposed to be, because a lot of times the listings don't copy exactly what the legal names of those sellers are. So be prepared to either have a Form 34 put in your listing to fully spell out these names, or to make sure you're checking that everything is signed fully around. When it comes to the legal description, negotiable terms in the contract are these two listed right here. They are not able to be changed without all parties' consent. So think about these things that are in the included items. You know, if they check boxes that these things stay, they are going to have to stay. They are part of the contract. The legal description should be attached and initialed. The reason initialed is because we also want to prove later down the road that we have delivered it and everybody has seen it. So the easiest way to do that is through initialing. If you forget the legal description or it's not included in the contract, that contract will be voidable by either party until the legal description is attached. Please don't go your entire purchase and sale with no legal description. You'll be putting yourself at risk. So just be safe and add the legal description, and also check to make sure that it matches. If you have included items in here, please remind your sellers throughout the transaction that those items do stay, because at the end of the transaction, if they're not there, we don't want to be the ones writing a check. Purchase price, earnest money, title companies are also negotiable terms that, if changed, will create a counter offer. So the earnest money has a default, though. It will default to 2 days if not filled in. The being held by who, be cautious if you're using a buyer, broker, firm to hold the earnest money. As our firm, we cannot hold it. We just don't have an account for the earnest money purposes in a trust. So all buyer money through our side should be held by the closing agent. And if a buyer wishes to use a different title company other than the one that's already pulled from, the buyer by default automatically agrees to pay a cancellation fee, if any, to the previous title company. So please keep that in mind as well. All listings should have title pulled. I mean, in order to put one together in any capacity beyond, with any competence, we need to be pulling title, as all of us do, and just making sure our sellers are who they say they are, and we are actually putting together a valid listing agreement. Because if we don't have a valid listing agreement, if we've listed the wrong name, then we don't have the right to sell it. Earnest money is the payment for default if the buyer breaches when a contingency is not there to protect them. So this is just kind of a, hey, think about this. If there is a release of earnest money, what consequences does the buyer face for breaching? And are you putting your sellers or buyers in a better place by releasing the earnest money, or a better place by keeping it in escrow? If a contract is signed and does not fit the guidelines of true mutual acceptance, but the purchase and sale agreement is sent to the lender and escrow, then mutual acceptance will be the date the earnest money is received by escrow. This delivery of earnest money marks an intent to move forward. So an example of this would be mutual accept. So an offer expires on Friday. One party signs it Friday, the other party signs it Saturday morning, and both of them agree that they want to move forward. They can deliver those to escrow, and through a default or an intent to move forward, we'll have a mutual contract once that earnest money is delivered. It's cleaner on all of our ends if we can get assigned around mutual acceptance within offer expiration dates. So if you can, please do that instead. The closing date is something that is absolutely required, because without the closing date, we don't have a date of performance. Therefore, we don't have any way to, we have nothing to gauge this contract off of. We cannot make it an enforceable contract with nothing to enforce. If I say, seller's going to paint that wall, I don't know when, someday, then we can't really enforce it because there is no end date. There is no performance date. So absolutely, without any exception, a closing date is required. If it's anything other than 9 p.m. on that date that you have listed, please mark the other box, because that could mean upon recording. If it is any other day than what's listed, a 65A or 65B is also required. And remember, for utilities, it is automatically waived unless requested. So if you want escrow to handle any of the utility swaps, please make sure you're checking that box to do so. The charges and assessments and information verification are also negotiable terms. So if these are changed, they do create a counter offer. Please make sure that you're just checking these things. And then anything in line 18, which is the addenda line, is not part of the contract at all. Those items do not need to be initialed if they're changed. They do not affect mutual acceptance. They are just a list of what is attached. And then finally, buyer and seller full name and date. You don't actually need to fill out the address, phone number, or anything like that during this mutual acceptance, although escrow will be requiring that information. It's not required to have mutual acceptance. So think about this question. A buyer's offer expires on the 7th. The seller delivers a counteroffer on the 8th. The buyer accepts the counteroffer and sends it back to the seller on the 8th. Is there mutual acceptance? Did the parties need to go back and change the expiration date of page one, of the purchase and sale agreement, and then have all the parties initial that change? There is mutual acceptance on the 8th. The fact that the buyer's offer expired is irrelevant. There is no need to go back and modify anything else. Essentially, that seller just sent a counteroffer that had 2 days to expire on the 8th, and the buyer chose to accept it within those times. So is the contract enforceable? Well, if it is, it's going to have a mutually accepted terms. All of those acceptances are going to come within the time of the expiration. It will have a legal description, and it will have an actual closing date. Remember not to use TBD or X number of days after X contingencies, or a number of days after a certain event. We can't control contingencies or events. We can control everything else. The only exception to this is going to be with the use of a 22B, because 22B will automatically give us the closing date, and it's in the contract that it does so. So if there's any other reason that you don't know a closing date, put an arbitrary closing date and do an extension if necessary, or change the closing date to a sooner date with a 22Y. Now, in order for a contract to be void, there are a few things that have to happen. A contract is considered void if a seller is under 18, if the seller or buyer has committed fraud, an illegal sale has taken place, there's a lack of capacity to make the decision, or the death of a single buyer. Death in some cases of a seller will also void a sale. If a seller dies in the middle of a transaction, a go-forward plan has to be in place so a representative can continue. And if not, the sale may be void. It's been more typical, though, that there's been a plan in place, and it just takes a couple extra weeks of getting the paperwork down from the estate to continue moving forward. So this is due if a seller passes away during a sale. This is due to the listing agreement no longer being valid because you no longer have a written listing agreement with that specific seller anymore. And this more occurs with a power of attorney, because the power of attorney loses the power to sign once that seller is no longer in the picture. Items that can be forgotten or accidentally left out and still create a mutual contract. You can forget the legal description. You can forget addendas of any kind, disclosures of any kind, or you can even forget earnest money. The only thing a contract needs to be enforceable is an agreement of terms and a date of performance. So remember, addenda added after mutual acceptance can be included if it's mutually acceptable. Any disclosures given after mutual acceptance are awarded a 3-day right of rescission. Most common one for this is set form 17. A 22J would be a good example of this too. If the lead-based paint disclosure is not signed around at mutual acceptance and it's given to the buyer afterwards, they do retain a 3-day right of rescission to make sure that they're okay with the fact that the home may have lead-based paint. Here is a question to think about. The buyer lines something out on the purchase and sale. So think about maybe a 22A, page 2 with the closing costs for this example, and initials the change and then sends it to the seller. And the seller signs it without initialing the change. Okay, so the seller received it with the buyer's change, the buyer's initials, but did not initial it back. Both parties have moved forward to mutual acceptance. And 4 days later, the seller realizes they missed the initials on 22A. Should the seller go back and make the correction, or should it be addressed in an addendum? And if the seller goes back and makes the correction, would that be a counter, even though both parties moved forward without one of the parties initialing the acknowledgement, and then without the seller's initials to change this? Is this an unenforceable part of the contract? So think about that term. We see this a lot, where a buyer sends something over, crosses it off, sends it over to the seller, and the seller signs it. And this could have been something that initially came up, or it could have been something along the way. And unfortunately, on the transaction coordination side, the TC has no idea when that change was made. But in this example, we are sending a document over that has changes, and those changes are being sent over as a full document to that seller, and the seller signs it without initialing. So in this case, no further action is needed to create this binding agreement. The buyer made the changes on the 21 before presenting the offer in this case. The seller signed the offer as it was presented. So it really doesn't matter at the end of the day if a change was made and only initialed by the offerer. If the person receiving the offer signs it and accepts it, that change is part of the binding agreement in their purchase and sale agreement. So had this revision been on the basis of a counter offer, then yes, both parties would have to initial it. But since the change was not part of a counter offer, but rather an initial offer, all the seller did was accept it as it was drafted with no requirement to initial the revision in order to create that binding agreement. So I'm not mentioning these things so we can get sloppy or lazy. The idea is we want to make sure we are initialing everything we can, because when we look back on this, we need to make sure we prove that our buyers or sellers saw these things, they were acknowledging them, they were okay with them, they were in agreement with them. These rules are the very, very minimum requirement. So when we go to our file and we look, as far as the compliance and the Department of Licensing is concerned, we're complying. But we are better than minimum, and our files are going to have very clear paper trails and documentation. So I'm bringing these things to your attention because the missing initials will not leave the buyer an out or give the seller a loophole. What items are delivered in the offer are the items that are included in the offer. Your transaction coordinator, though, will not know this communication, so it's up to you to make it very clear with the signatures and initials on every form and with each change that's made. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I was able to offer something new for you.